Hello and welcome. Today, I will be whispering to you about the events leading up to the Vietnam War. The roots of the Vietnam War trace back to the colonial era, particularly the period of French Indochina. In the late 19th century, the French colonized the region, which included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. During this period, nationalist movements began to rise in Vietnam, with people seeking independence from French colonial rule. The desire for self-determination grew stronger as the Vietnamese people experienced the harsh realities of colonial exploitation and cultural suppression. In the 1920s and 1930s, communist ideas began to spread throughout Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, a prominent communist leader who had spent time in France and the Soviet Union, founded the Viet Minh, an organization dedicated to both independence and communist ideals. The Viet Minh sought to unite all Vietnamese, regardless of political affiliation, in the struggle against colonial rule. During World War II, Japan occupied French Indochina, and the Viet Minh started a resistance movement against both the Japanese and the French. In 1945, following Japan's surrender, the Viet Minh declared an independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi, with Ho Chi Minh as its president. However, the French were determined to reassert their control over the region, leading to the First Indochina War. The First Indochina War lasted from 1946 to 1954, with the Viet Minh fighting against French forces. The war was characterized by guerrilla warfare, with the Viet Minh using their knowledge of the local terrain to their advantage. The French, on the other hand, relied on conventional military tactics and struggled to adapt to the unconventional warfare employed by the Viet Minh. The turning point came in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the Viet Minh achieved a decisive victory over the French. The French had established a fortified base in the valley of Dien Bien Phu, hoping to lure the Viet Minh into a conventional battle. However, the Viet Minh, under the command of General Von Nguyen Giap, surrounded the French position and laid siege to the base. After weeks of intense fighting and heavy casualties, the French forces were overwhelmed and forced to surrender. This defeat led to the Geneva Accords, which ended French colonial rule in Indochina and temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The north was controlled by the communist Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, while the south was governed by a non-communist regime under Emperor Bao Dai. The division of Vietnam was meant to be temporary, with national elections planned for 1956 to unify the country. However, these elections never took place. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, supported the South Vietnamese government. In 1955, Ngo Dinh Diem became the Prime Minister of South Vietnam and later declared himself president after a controversial referendum. Diem's regime received substantial economic and military aid from the United States, which viewed South Vietnam as a bulwark against communism in the region. However, Diem's leadership was marked by corruption, nepotism, and religious discrimination, particularly against the Buddhist majority. Diem's government, while supported by the U.S., faced significant internal opposition. His policies and governance were increasingly viewed as authoritarian and corrupt. The National Liberation Front, NLF, also known as the Viet Cong, was formed in the south with support from the north, aiming to overthrow Diem's regime and unify the country under communist rule. The increasing tension and conflict between the north and south, along with growing American involvement, set the stage for the Vietnam War. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, the situation in Vietnam continued to deteriorate. The Viet Cong conducted guerrilla warfare against the South Vietnamese government, attacking military outposts, government buildings, and infrastructure. The insurgency grew stronger as more South Vietnamese peasants and disillusioned citizens joined the Viet Cong, drawn by their promises of land reform in opposition to Diem's oppressive regime. In response to the escalating conflict, the United States increased its support for South Vietnam. American military advisors were sent to train and assist the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, and economic aid was provided to bolster the South Vietnamese economy. Despite these efforts, the South Vietnamese government struggled to contain the Viet Cong insurgency, which continued to gain strength and support. This situation reached a critical point in 1963. Diem's repressive policies, particularly against the Buddhist population, led to widespread protests and civil unrest. The most notable incident was the self-immolation of Thich Quang Duc, a Buddhist monk who set himself on fire in Saigon in protest of Diem's regime. The image of his sacrifice shocked the world and highlighted the deep divisions within South Vietnamese society. In November 1963, a coup was orchestrated by South Vietnamese generals with the tacit approval of the United States. Diem and his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, were assassinated, leading to a period of political instability and a series of short-lived governments in South Vietnam. This turmoil further weakened the South Vietnamese government's ability to combat the Viet Cong insurgency. The assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963 marked a turning point in South Vietnam's political landscape. The subsequent power vacuum led to a period of instability, with multiple governments rising and falling in quick succession. This lack of stable leadership made it increasingly difficult for South Vietnam to effectively counter the growing Viet Cong insurgency. U.S. escalation. As the political situation in South Vietnam deteriorated, the United States became more deeply involved in the conflict. President John F. Kennedy, before his assassination in November 1963, had already increased the number of American military advisors in Vietnam. By the time of his death, there were approximately 16,000 U.S. military personnel in Vietnam. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, inherited the escalating conflict and faced mounting pressure to take decisive action against the communist forces. In August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, further escalating U.S. involvement. North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked the USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer, in the Gulf of Tonkin. Although the details of the incident were later questioned, it provided the Johnson administration with a pretext to seek congressional approval for greater military intervention. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed by Congress on August 7, 1964, granting President Johnson the authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. With this newfound authority, Johnson authorized a significant escalation of U.S. military involvement. In March 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder commenced, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam aimed at weakening the communist forces and disrupting their supply lines. This marked the beginning of large-scale American combat operations in Vietnam. By the end of 1965, there were over 184,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam, a number that would continue to grow in the following years. The situation in South Vietnam. Despite the increased American presence, the situation in South Vietnam remained precarious. The South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, struggled with issues of corruption, poor leadership, and low morale. Many soldiers were poorly trained and ill-equipped, making them less effective in combat against the highly motivated and experienced Viet Cong fighters. The Viet Cong continued their guerrilla warfare tactics, launching surprise attacks, ambushes, and sabotage operations across the countryside. The ARVN's inability to secure rural areas allowed the Viet Cong to maintain strongholds and gain the support of the local population. The Communist forces used the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of supply routes running through Laos and Cambodia, to transport troops, weapons, and supplies from North Vietnam to the south. Despite intensive bombing by the U.S. Air Force, the trail remained operational and a critical lifeline for the Viet Cong. Social and political dynamics. The social and political dynamics in South Vietnam were complex and multifaceted. The urban population, particularly in cities like Saigon, experienced relative prosperity and modernization, often benefiting from American aid and economic programs. However, the rural population, which made up the majority of South Vietnam, faced hardships and dislocation due to the ongoing conflict. The war disrupted agricultural production, leading to food shortages and economic instability in the countryside. Religious and ethnic tensions also played a significant role in the conflict. Diem's regime had favored Catholics, leading to resentment among the Buddhist majority. This tension continued to simmer even after Diem's assassination, contributing to the overall instability. Additionally, ethnic minorities, such as the Montagnards in the Central Highlands, were often caught in the crossfire between government forces and the Viet Cong, further complicating the social fabric of South Vietnam. The Viet Cong capitalized on these social and political divisions, portraying themselves as champions of the oppressed and promising land reforms and social justice. Their message resonated with many rural Vietnamese who felt marginalized by the central government. The Viet Cong's ability to blend in with the civilian population and their use of guerrilla tactics made it challenging for American and South Vietnamese forces to effectively combat them without causing significant collateral damage and alienating the local population. As the United States escalated its involvement in Vietnam, both the political and military landscapes continued to evolve, setting the stage for a full-scale war. The role of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail played a crucial role in the conflict. This complex network of jumbo paths and trails ran from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. It allowed the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong to transport troops, weapons, and supplies to support their operations in the south. Despite intense bombing campaigns by the U.S. to disrupt this supply line, the trail remained a vital artery for the Communist forces. The ingenuity and resilience of the North Vietnamese in maintaining and protecting the trail were key factors in their ability to sustain the insurgency. The Strategic Hamlet Program. In an effort to counter the Viet Cong's influence in rural areas, the South Vietnamese government, with American support, implemented the Strategic Hamlet Program in 1962. The program aimed to isolate rural populations from the Viet Cong by relocating villagers to fortified hamlets that were protected by government forces. The idea was to create secure communities that would be free from Viet Cong infiltration and influence. However, the program faced significant challenges and ultimately failed. Many villagers were forcibly relocated, leading to resentment and loss of support for the South Vietnamese government. The fortified hamlets were often poorly constructed and inadequately defended, making them easy targets for Viet Cong attacks. Instead of isolating the Viet Cong, the program often drove more people into their arms, as displaced villagers joined the insurgency out of anger and frustration. increasing U.S. military involvement. As the situation in South Vietnam continued to deteriorate, the United States increased its military involvement. By the end of 1964, the number of American military personnel in Vietnam had grown significantly. The decision to escalate was influenced by the belief in the domino theory, which held that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would follow. In 1965, President Johnson authorized the deployment of combat troops to Vietnam, marking a significant escalation of the conflict. The first U.S. combat troops arrived in March 1965, and by the end of the year, there were over 184,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. This number continued to increase, reaching over 500,000 by 1968. The U.S. strategy focused on search and destroy missions aimed at engaging and defeating Viet Cong and NBA forces. These operations involved extensive use of artillery, airstrikes, and ground troops. However, the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong made it difficult to achieve decisive victories. The dense jungle terrain and the enemy's ability to blend in with the civilian population further complicated the U.S. military efforts. The Battle of Ia Drang. One of the first major engagements between U.S. and North Vietnamese forces was the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965. This battle, fought in the Central Highlands, was significant for several reasons. It was the first large-scale battle involving American troops and highlighted the intense and brutal nature of the conflict. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of U.S. air mobility and firepower, as helicopters played a crucial role in transporting troops and providing support. However, it also revealed the determination and resilience of the North Vietnamese forces. Both sides claimed victory, but the high casualty rates foreshadowed the prolonged and costly nature of the war. Public opinion and anti-war sentiment. As U.S. involvement in Vietnam increased, so did public scrutiny and anti-war sentiment. The media played a significant role in shaping public perception of the war. For the first time, television brought the realities of combat into American living rooms. Images of wounded soldiers, civilian casualties, and the destruction wrought by the conflict stirred public debate and concern. Anti-war protests began to grow, particularly on college campuses. Many Americans questioned the justification for the war and the rising human and financial costs. The civil rights movement and other social upheavals of the 1960s also influenced the anti-war movement, creating a broader context of dissent and demand for change. By the end of 1965, the stage was set for a prolonged and contentious conflict. The U.S. was fully committed to supporting South Vietnam, while the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were equally determined to achieve unification under communist rule. The events of the preceding years had laid the groundwork for one of the most divisive and devastating wars in modern history. The beginning of the conflict. The Vietnam War truly escalated with the direct military intervention of the United States in support of South Vietnam. In 1965, the arrival of the first American combat troops marked a significant turning point, ushering in a period of intense military operations and major battles. Major engagements and strategies, 1965 to 1966. In March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops landed in Vietnam, officially beginning America's direct involvement in the war. Initially deployed to protect American air bases, their role quickly expanded to include offensive operations against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, NBA. The U.S. military strategy focused on search and destroy missions, aiming to locate and eliminate enemy forces through superior firepower and mobility. One of the first major engagements was the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965. This battle, fought in the Central Highlands, was a significant test for American forces and their strategy of air mobility. U.S. helicopters were used extensively to transport troops, supply them, and provide close air support. Despite suffering heavy casualties, American forces managed to inflict substantial losses on the NBA. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of air mobility but also highlighted the determination and resilience of the North Vietnamese forces. During this period, the U.S. also launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The goal was to weaken the North Vietnamese war effort by destroying infrastructure, disrupting supply lines, and demoralizing the population. However, the campaign faced significant challenges. The North Vietnamese adapted quickly, dispersing their assets and using sophisticated air defenses to counter American aircraft. The bombing campaign failed to achieve its strategic objectives and often hardened the resolve of the North Vietnamese. The war intensifies, 1967 to 1968. By 1967, the number of American troops in Vietnam had grown significantly, reaching over 500,000. The U.S. military continued its strategy of search and destroy missions, which often involved large-scale sweeps through areas suspected of harboring Viet Cong or NBA forces. Despite these efforts, the guerrilla tactics employed by the enemy made it difficult to secure lasting victories. The Tet Offensive, launched by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong in January 1968, marked a pivotal moment in the war. During the Vietnamese New Year, Tet holiday, Communist forces launched a series of coordinated attacks on major cities and towns across South Vietnam, including the capital, Saigon. The scale and intensity of the offensive caught the American and South Vietnamese forces by surprise. Although the Tet Offensive was ultimately a military failure for the North Vietnamese, as they suffered heavy casualties and failed to hold any significant territory, it had profound psychological and political impacts. The extensive media coverage of the offensive, including images of fierce fighting in Saigon and the temporary capture of the U.S. Embassy, shocked the American public. The perception that the U.S. was not making progress in the war eroded public support and increased anti-war sentiment. Domestic opposition and changes in strategy. As the war dragged on, domestic opposition in the United States grew. The anti-war movement gained momentum, with protests, demonstrations, and public figures speaking out against the war. The draft, which conscripted young men into military service, became a focal point of dissent. The rising number of American casualties and the lack of clear progress led many to question the war's justification and objectives. In response to growing public discontent and the realities on the ground, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced in March 1968 that he would not seek re-election. His successor, Richard Nixon, campaigned on a promise to achieve peace with honor and began to implement a policy of Vietnamization. This strategy aimed to gradually withdraw American troops while increasing the combat role of the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN. The goal was to enable the South Vietnamese to take over the defense of their country, reducing the U.S. role in the conflict. The My Lai Massacre. In March 1968, another incident further fueled anti-war sentiment and shocked the international community, the My Lai Massacre. American soldiers from Company C of the 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, 11th Brigade of the Americal Division entered the village of My Lai on a search and destroy mission. Believing the village to be a Viet Cong stronghold, they opened fire on unarmed civilians, killing between 347 and 504 men, women, and children. The massacre was initially covered up by the military, but it eventually came to light in November 1969, sparking outrage and deepening public disillusionment with the war. The My Lai massacre highlighted the moral complexities and atrocities of the war, leading to increased calls for an end to the conflict. It also intensified the debate over the conduct of American troops and the policies that had led to such actions. The Paris Peace Talks. In May 1968, peace talks began in Paris between representatives of the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. The negotiations were complex and protracted, with both sides seeking to gain the upper hand. The primary issues included the withdrawal of U.S. troops, the establishment of a ceasefire, and the political future of South Vietnam. Despite numerous rounds of talks, progress was slow. Both sides remained deeply entrenched in their positions, and fighting continued on the ground. The talks highlighted the difficulties in achieving a diplomatic solution to the conflict, as well as the deep mistrust and animosity between the warring parties. The impact of media coverage. The media played a crucial role in shaping public perception of the Vietnam War. For the first time, television brought the realities of combat into American living rooms. Graphic images of wounded soldiers, civilian casualties, and the destruction caused by the war were broadcast daily, creating a sense of immediacy and urgency. Journalists and reporters, who had relatively unrestricted access to the battlefield, provided first-hand accounts of the fighting. Their reports often contradicted official government statements, leading to increased skepticism and distrust of the administration. The media's portrayal of the war as a quagmire with no clear path to victory contributed to growing anti-war sentiment and calls for withdrawal. As the 1970s began, the Vietnam War continued to escalate, with significant developments both on the battlefield and in diplomatic efforts. The U.S. policy of Vietnamization aimed to reduce American involvement while strengthening South Vietnamese forces. Vietnamization and the expansion of the war, 1970 to 1971. President Richard Nixon's strategy of Vietnamization was designed to transfer the burden of combat to the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, while gradually withdrawing American troops. This policy aimed to build up the ARVN's capacity to defend South Vietnam independently, thereby allowing the U.S. to reduce its military presence without abandoning its ally. Despite these efforts, the ARVN faced significant challenges. Corruption, poor leadership, and low morale plagued the South Vietnamese military, making it difficult to effectively counter the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. Additionally, the ARVN struggled with logistical and operational issues, further complicating their ability to take over the primary combat role from American forces. In 1970, the U.S. expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia in an attempt to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines and sanctuaries. The Cambodian incursion, launched in April 1970, involved American and ARVN forces crossing the border to attack communist bases. While the incursion achieved some tactical successes, it also sparked widespread protests and intensified anti-war sentiment in the United States. The expansion of the war into Cambodia also had significant political consequences within the country. The incursion destabilized the Cambodian government, leading to increased support for the Khmer Rouge, or radical communist movement. This set the stage for further conflict and atrocities in Cambodia. the invasion of Laos, and continued conflict. In February 1971, South Vietnamese forces, supported by U.S. air power, launched Operation Lam Son 719, an invasion of Laos aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The operation was a critical test of the ARVN's ability to conduct independent offensive operations. However, it faced fierce resistance from North Vietnamese forces and quickly became a disaster for the South Vietnamese. The ARVN suffered heavy casualties and was forced to withdraw, demonstrating the limitations of Vietnamization. Despite these setbacks, Nixon continued to reduce the number of American troops in Vietnam. By the end of 1971, U.S. troop levels had decreased significantly, and the focus shifted to providing military and economic aid to South Vietnam. The Easter Offensive and renewed bombing, 1972. In March 1972, the North Vietnamese launched the Easter Offensive, a massive conventional invasion aimed at capturing key cities and territories in South Vietnam. The offensive was the largest and most ambitious attack by the North Vietnamese since the Tet Offensive in 1968. It involved a coordinated assault across 3 fronts: the northern provinces near the DMZ, the Central Highlands, and the areas surrounding Saigon. The ARVN, despite initial setbacks, managed to hold off the North Vietnamese with substantial support from U.S. air power and naval forces. President Nixon ordered Operation Linebacker, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, targeting logistics, infrastructure, and military positions. The use of air power, including the deployment of B-52 bombers, played a crucial role in blunting the North Vietnamese advance and stabilizing the front lines. The Easter Offensive was ultimately repelled, but it exposed the continued vulnerability of South Vietnam and the challenges faced by the ARVN in the absence of large-scale American ground forces. The offensive also demonstrated the resilience and determination of the North Vietnamese, who were willing to commit significant resources to achieve their objectives. Peace negotiations and the Paris Peace Accords. Throughout the early 1970s, peace negotiations continued in Paris, but progress remained slow. Both sides were deeply entrenched in their positions, and mutual distrust hindered meaningful dialogue. However, the changing dynamics on the battlefield and increasing domestic pressure in the United States pushed the Nixon administration to intensify its efforts to reach a settlement. In October 1972, a breakthrough occurred when National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho reached a tentative agreement. The proposed terms included a ceasefire, the withdrawal of U.S. troops, and the return of American prisoners of war. Additionally, it allowed North Vietnamese forces to remain in South Vietnam, effectively recognizing their presence and influence. However, the initial agreement faced opposition from South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, who demanded significant changes. This delayed the finalization of the peace accords and led to a renewed escalation of bombing by the U.S. to pressure North Vietnam into accepting their revised terms. Finally, on January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, officially ending U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of remaining U.S. troops, the return of prisoners of war, and political reconciliation between North and South Vietnam. Despite the formal end of American combat operations, the conflict between North and South Vietnam continued. As the 1970s began, the Vietnam War continued to escalate, with significant developments both on the battlefield and in diplomatic efforts. The U.S. policy of Vietnamization aimed to reduce American involvement while strengthening South Vietnamese forces. Vietnamization and the expansion of the war, 1970 to 1971. President Richard Nixon's strategy of Vietnamization was designed to transfer the burden of combat to the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, while gradually withdrawing American troops. This policy aimed to build up the ARVN's capacity to defend South Vietnam independently, thereby allowing the U.S. to reduce its military presence without abandoning its ally. Despite these efforts, the ARVN faced significant challenges. Corruption, poor leadership, and low morale plagued the South Vietnamese military, making it difficult to effectively counter the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. Additionally, the ARVN struggled with logistical and operational issues, further complicating their ability to take over the primary combat role from American forces. In 1970, the U.S. expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia in an attempt to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines and sanctuaries. The Cambodian incursion, launched in April 1970, involved American and ARVN forces crossing the border to attack communist bases. While the incursion achieved some tactical successes, it also sparked widespread protests and intensified anti-war sentiment in the United States. The expansion of the war into Cambodia also had significant political consequences within the country. The incursion destabilized the Cambodian government, leading to increased support for the Khmer Rouge, or radical communist movement. This set the stage for further conflict and atrocities in Cambodia. The invasion of Laos and continued conflict. In February 1971, South Vietnamese forces, supported by U.S. air power, launched Operation Lam Son 719, an invasion of Laos aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The operation was a critical test of the ARVN's ability to conduct independent offensive operations. However, it faced fierce resistance from North Vietnamese forces and quickly became a disaster for the South Vietnamese. The ARVN suffered heavy casualties and was forced to withdraw, demonstrating the limitations of Vietnamization. Despite these setbacks, Nixon continued to reduce the number of American troops in Vietnam. By the end of 1971, U.S. troop levels had decreased significantly, and the focus shifted to providing military and economic aid to South Vietnam. The Easter Offensive and renewed bombing, 1972. In March 1972, the North Vietnamese launched the Easter Offensive, a massive conventional invasion aimed at capturing key cities and territories in South Vietnam. The offensive was the largest and most ambitious attack by the North Vietnamese since the Tet Offensive in 1968. It involved a coordinated assault across 3 fronts: the northern provinces near the DMZ, the Central Highlands, and the areas surrounding Saigon. The ARVN, despite initial setbacks, managed to hold off the North Vietnamese with substantial support from U.S. air power and naval forces. President Nixon ordered Operation Linebacker, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, targeting logistics, infrastructure, and military positions. The use of air power, including the deployment of B-52 bombers, played a crucial role in blunting the North Vietnamese advance and stabilizing the front lines. The Easter Offensive was ultimately repelled, but it exposed the continued vulnerability of South Vietnam and the challenges faced by the ARVN in the absence of large-scale American ground forces. The offensive also demonstrated the resilience and determination of the North Vietnamese, who were willing to commit significant resources to achieve their objectives. Peace negotiations and the Paris Peace Accords. Throughout the early 1970s, peace negotiations continued in Paris, but progress remained slow. Both sides were deeply entrenched in their positions, and mutual distrust hindered meaningful dialogue. However, the changing dynamics on the battlefield and increasing domestic pressure in the United States pushed the Nixon administration to intensify its efforts to reach a settlement. In October 1972, a breakthrough occurred when National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho reached a tentative agreement. The proposed terms included a ceasefire, the withdrawal of U.S. troops, and the return of American prisoners of war. Additionally, it allowed North Vietnamese forces to remain in South Vietnam, effectively recognizing their presence and influence. However, the initial agreement faced opposition from South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, who demanded significant changes. This delayed the finalization of the peace accords and led to a renewed escalation of bombing by the U.S. to pressure North Vietnam into accepting their revised terms. Finally, on January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, officially ending U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of remaining U.S. troops, the return of prisoners of war, and political reconciliation between North and South Vietnam. Despite the formal end of American combat operations, the conflict between North and South Vietnam continued. The final years of the war, 1973 to 1975. After the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, the United States began its final withdrawal from Vietnam. However, the war between North and South Vietnam did not end. The South Vietnamese government, led by President Thieu, struggled to maintain control and resist the advancing communist forces. Post-accords conflict. Despite the ceasefire agreement, fighting continued almost immediately after the Paris Peace Accords were signed. Both sides accused each other of violations, and skirmishes and battles persisted throughout South Vietnam. The ARVN, despite significant American financial and military aid, was increasingly overmatched by the well-supplied and determined North Vietnamese forces. The United States, while no longer directly involved in combat, continued to provide substantial aid to South Vietnam. However, the Watergate scandal and subsequent resignation of President Nixon in August 1974 weakened American political will to support the war. Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, faced a Congress increasingly unwilling to commit further resources to the conflict. The final North Vietnamese offensive. In early 1975, North Vietnam launched a massive offensive known as the Ho Chi Minh Campaign. The objective was to capture Saigon and bring about the final collapse of the South Vietnamese government. The offensive began with the capture of Ban My Thuột in the Central Highlands in March 1975, which led to a rapid and catastrophic collapse of ARVN defenses. The fall of Ban My Thuột triggered a series of chaotic retreats and the abandonment of key positions by South Vietnamese forces. The North Vietnamese, sensing the imminent collapse of their enemy, pressed their advantage, capturing cities and provinces with little resistance. The fall of Saigon. By April 1975, the North Vietnamese forces had encircled Saigon. The situation in the city became increasingly desperate as thousands of South Vietnamese civilians and military personnel sought to flee the advancing communist forces. The U.S. initiated Operation Frequent Wind, the final phase of the evacuation of American civilians and at-risk Vietnamese from Saigon. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, and the South Vietnamese government officially surrendered. The iconic image of helicopters evacuating people from the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy became a powerful symbol of the end of the Vietnam War. The fall of Saigon marked the reunification of Vietnam under communist control and the definitive end of the conflict. The aftermath. The Vietnam War had profound and lasting impacts on both Vietnam and the United States. In Vietnam, the war resulted in immense human suffering, with millions of Vietnamese killed, wounded, or displaced. The country faced the daunting task of rebuilding its shattered infrastructure and economy. In the United States, the Vietnam War left deep scars on the national psyche. It was the longest and most divisive conflict in American history, leading to widespread protests, political turmoil, and a reevaluation of U.S. foreign policy. The war also had a significant impact on the American military, leading to changes in strategy, tactics, and the way future conflicts were approached. Key figures of the Vietnam War. Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, and a key figure in the struggle for Vietnamese independence and unification. Born Nguyen Sinh Cong in 1890, he became involved in revolutionary activities at a young age. Ho Chi Minh was a founding member of the Indochinese Communist Party and led the Viet Minh, a coalition of nationalist groups that fought for independence from French colonial rule. After the defeat of the French in 1954, Ho Chi Minh became the president of North Vietnam, leading the country through the Vietnam War until his death in 1969. He is remembered as a symbol of Vietnamese nationalism and a hero of the Vietnamese people. Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem was the first president of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, from 1955 until his assassination in 1963. Born into a prominent Catholic family in 1901, Diem was an ardent anti-communist who sought to modernize and stabilize South Vietnam. However, his authoritarian policies, religious discrimination against Buddhists, and nepotism led to widespread discontent and civil unrest. Diem's refusal to implement political reforms and his harsh repression of dissent ultimately undermined his regime. He was overthrown and killed in a military coup, which had the tacit approval of the United States, leading to a period of political instability in South Vietnam. General Vo Nguyen Giap. General Vo Nguyen Giap was the military commander of the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and one of the most prominent military strategists of the 20th century. Born in 1911, Giap played a crucial role in the First Indochina War, leading Viet Minh forces to victory against the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. During the Vietnam War, Giap orchestrated major campaigns, including the Tet Offensive in 1968 and the Easter Offensive in 1972. Known for his strategic brilliance and tenacity, Giap's leadership was instrumental in the North Vietnamese victory. He remained a respected figure in Vietnam until his death in 2013. General William Westmoreland. General William Westmoreland was the commander of U.S. military operations in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968. Born in 1914, Westmoreland served in World War II and the Korean War before taking command in Vietnam. He implemented a strategy of attrition, seeking to wear down the enemy through superior firepower and large-scale search and destroy missions. Despite achieving tactical successes, Westmoreland's approach failed to secure a decisive victory and contributed to rising American casualties and public discontent. He was replaced in 1968, but his tenure remains a controversial chapter in U.S. military history. Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was the U.S. National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State under Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Born in 1923, Kissinger played a key role in shaping U.S. foreign policy during the Vietnam War. He was a primary architect of the policy of Vietnamization and led the secret negotiations with North Vietnamese representatives in Paris. Kissinger's efforts culminated in the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, which led to the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. Despite his contributions to ending U.S. involvement, Kissinger's legacy is also marked by the controversial expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos. Le Duc Tho. Le Duc Tho was a senior North Vietnamese politician and diplomat who played a crucial role in the Paris peace talks. Born in 1911, he was a founding member of the Indochinese Communist Party and held various important positions in the North Vietnamese government. As a chief negotiator for North Vietnam, Le Duc Tho engaged in prolonged and often contentious negotiations with Henry Kissinger. For their efforts in negotiating the Paris Peace Accords, both Kissinger and Le Duc Tho were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973. However, Le Duc Tho declined the prize, citing ongoing conflict in Vietnam. President Lyndon B. Johnson. President Lyndon B. Johnson was the 36th President of the United States, serving from 1963 to 1969. Born in 1908, Johnson assumed the presidency following the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He significantly escalated U.S. involvement in Vietnam, believing that American military intervention was necessary to prevent the spread of communism. Johnson's administration saw a massive increase in troop deployments and the initiation of major bombing campaigns. However, the growing cost of the war, both in terms of human lives and economic expenditure, along with rising anti-war sentiment, eroded his political support. Johnson chose not to seek re-election in 1968. President Richard Nixon. President Richard Nixon was the 37th President of the United States, serving from 1969 to 1974. Born in 1913, Nixon campaigned on a promise to achieve peace with honor and sought to end U.S. involvement in Vietnam through the policy of Vietnamization. He also authorized significant bombing campaigns and expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos to disrupt communist supply lines. Nixon's administration negotiated the Paris Peace Accords, which led to the withdrawal of American troops. However, his presidency was overshadowed by the Watergate scandal, leading to his resignation in 1974. Key events of the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred in August 1964 and significantly escalated U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Allegedly, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer, in the Gulf of Tonkin. A second attack was reported 2 days later, although the details remain controversial and disputed. In response, President Lyndon B. Johnson sought and received congressional approval for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted him broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. This resolution marked the beginning of large-scale U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder, 1965 to 1968. Operation Rolling Thunder was a sustained bombing campaign conducted by the U.S. against North Vietnam from March 1965 to November 1968. The objective was to weaken the North Vietnamese war effort by targeting infrastructure, industrial sites, and transportation networks. Despite dropping vast amounts of ordnance, the campaign faced significant challenges. North Vietnam's air defenses improved, and the bombing often hardened the resolve of the North Vietnamese people. The operation failed to achieve its strategic goals and is seen as a controversial aspect of the war. The Battle of Ia Trang, 1965. The Battle of Ia Trang, fought in November 1965, was the first major engagement between U.S. forces and the North Vietnamese Army. The battle took place in the central highlands of South Vietnam and demonstrated the effectiveness of American air mobility tactics, which utilized helicopters for troop deployment and support. Despite heavy casualties on both sides, the battle highlighted the fierce determination of the North Vietnamese and foreshadowed the intense and brutal nature of the conflict. The Tet Offensive, 1968. The Tet Offensive was a coordinated series of attacks launched by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong during the Vietnamese New Year, Tet, holiday in January 1968. The offensive targeted major cities, towns, and military bases across South Vietnam, including Saigon. The scale and intensity of the attacks surprised American and South Vietnamese forces. While the Tet Offensive was a military failure for the North Vietnamese, as they failed to hold any significant territory and suffered heavy casualties, it had profound psychological and political impacts. The extensive media coverage of the offensive shocked the American public and eroded support for the war, leading to increased anti-war sentiment and calls for U.S. withdrawal. The My Lai Massacre, 1968. The My Lai Massacre occurred on March 16, 1968, when American soldiers from Company C of the 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, 11th Brigade of the Americal Division killed between 347 and 504 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians in the village of My Lai. Believing the village to be a Viet Cong stronghold, the soldiers opened fire on men, women, and children. The massacre was initially covered up by the military but eventually came to light in November 1969, sparking outrage and deepening public disillusionment with the war. The incident highlighted the moral complexities and atrocities of the war, leading to increased calls for an end to the conflict. The Paris Peace Accords, 1973. After years of intense negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973, officially ending U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of remaining U.S. troops, the return of prisoners of war, and political reconciliation between North and South Vietnam. Despite the formal end of American combat operations, the conflict between North and South Vietnam continued, with the North eventually achieving victory in 1975. The Fall of Saigon, 1975. The Fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, marked the end of the Vietnam War. North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, leading to the unconditional surrender of the South Vietnamese government. The event signified the reunification of Vietnam under communist control. The iconic images of helicopters evacuating people from the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy became symbols of the chaotic and desperate end to the conflict. The Fall of Saigon marked the culmination of years of intense and brutal warfare, reshaping the political landscape of Southeast Asia. Thank you for listening to this detailed account of the Vietnam War. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more historical narratives, please consider subscribing to my channel. Your support means a lot and helps me bring you more content. Feel free to leave your comments and suggestions for future topics. Thank you once again, and stay tuned for more captivating historical stories.